Okay, so the heart, as we said, beats all by itself. Um, the innervation of the heart just modulates the heart. So the heart just does this process. It beats, then it beats again, then it beats again because these IF channels, they open, they close, they reopen, they close, they reopen, they close, and so you just keep generating this heartbeat. However, the nervous system can modify the heart, and so you have the autonomic nervous system. Now, if I want to slow the heart rate down, what I want to do is I want to hyperpolarize the cell. So to slow the heart rate down, I want to hyperpolarize the cell and then slowly get to the next heartbeat. So I'm extending this out. So think about this. If you were designing a system, what would you do? What type of channel would you want to act upon? Well, with the autonomic nervous system, you have the parasympathetic division, you have the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve releases ACH. Now, ACH, acetylcholine, it's going to plug into a muscarinic receptor, okay? And so this cholinergic muscarinic receptor, this subtype right here is going to be an M2, so this is a muscarinic type 2 receptor. These receptors are going to be linked to a GI protein. Now, GI protein, the G is the protein, I just stands for inhibitory. So how can we, when ACH plugs in this M2 receptor and we activate this GI protein, how can we get this to move this direction? Well, one option is to open a potassium channel. So when ACH plugs into the M2 receptor, it activates the GI protein. The GI protein opens a potassium channel. Potassium goes out and my membrane potential drifts away from threshold. However, as potassium goes out, what's going to happen is it's going to become more negative inside the cell, which is going to draw sodium in faster through these IF channels, and then result in the opening of the T-type calcium channels. So we want to kind of oppose that also. So not only do we open the potassium, but we kind of shut down or narrow down these transitory T-type calcium channels. So we hyperpolarize and it takes us longer to get back to threshold because we're kind of squeezing down on these T-type calcium channels. So that is called a negative chronotropic effect. Negative meaning because it has a negative effect on chronos, time. So chronos is time, and so negative chronotropic would be a decrease in heart rate. So this would cause a decrease in heart rate. Well, think about how you're going to increase heart rate. With an increase in heart rate, that's driven by your sympathetic nervous system. Now, your sympathetic nervous system is going to release epinephrine, norepinephrine. So when epinephrine plugs into a beta receptor, all right, and these are beta 1 receptors, these beta 1 receptors, what's going to happen is they're going to be linked with GS proteins. So these GS proteins that they're linked to, okay, these GS proteins they're going to link to, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to get my heart rate beating faster. So I want to take this angle right here, and I want to shift it this way. So how might we do that? Well, one of the ways we can do that is we can open more IF channels. Because the more IF channels that we open up, the faster sodium can come in and the faster we can get our heart to beat. So that's called a positive chronotropic. So ACH plugs into a muscarinic type 2 receptor, activates a GI protein which opens a potassium channel to hyperpolarize the cell. It suppresses entry through the T-type calcium channels to make it longer to get up to threshold, and it slowed our heart rate down. Norepinephrine sped our heart rate up. Well, your heart wants to beat by itself. If I were to take this away right here, this SA node wants to beat about 80 to 100 times per minute. However, you can take your heart rate right now and you might have a resting heart rate of 60 beats per minute or 70 beats per minute. That's because ACH is plugging in and causing your heart to slow down. When norepinephrine plugs in, it's going to cause your heart to speed up. Clinically, if you have a patient that has a fast heart rate, let's say that they've got something called AFib with RVR, where they have this rapid ventricular rate. You can give them drugs that will actually slow their heart rate. Now I can use a calcium channel blocker like diltiazem or Rapamil, but another thing I can just give them prophylactically so their heart doesn't beat fast is metoprolol, because metoprolol is a beta blocker. So metoprolol comes over here, and what happens is it blocks the beta 1 receptor. if I block the beta 1 receptor, I can't drive the heart rate past that 100 beats per minute because it's being blocked. And so the fastest I can go is the intrinsic rate of depolarization of the SA node. But that's only if I fully block the beta receptors. Okay? Now, let's look at the effect of the sympathetic nervous system on these contractile myocytes. Now, one thing to note is that in the ventricles, the myocytes don't have muscarinic receptors. Since there's no muscarinic receptors on the contractile myocytes in the ventricles, ACH can't do anything to it. However, what they do have is they do have beta 1 receptors. So activation of beta 1 receptors by norepinephrine, what that's going to do is that's going to increase the strength of contraction. So when I look at cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. Well, we've already determined that over here we have a beta 1 receptor, so activation of beta 1 receptors by epinephrine can increase your heart rate, which is going to increase your cardiac output. If I activate the beta 1 receptors on the cardiac myocytes, that's going to increase your stroke volume. All right, so let's look and see how that does that. Now, under normal circumstances, when I have a contraction, what's taking place is right here at phase 2. Okay, we'll just review. I've opened at phase 4. My inward rectifier potassium channels are open. I'm not moving any direction. I'm just moving along this axis. But when I have a depolarization of the SA node, it pushes these positive charges through, and it opens my voltage-gated sodium channel. So I'm coming up this direction. They close. I open my transitory potassium channels. I drop down here, but then my L-type calcium channels open up. So here's what calcium does. When calcium comes into the cell, it's going to plug into a receptor within the cell. And this receptor is called an RYR2 receptor. It's a ryanodine receptor. Now, when calcium plugs in to this ryanodine receptor, what it results in is calcium release. So I have calcium-induced calcium release. And then, of course, calcium is going to go bind troponin, pull or activate troponin and pull tropomyosin out of the way, and then my myosin head can bind to my actin, and I'm going to get a contraction. Well, once calcium is released, I actually want to get calcium back out. And so I release the calcium, have my contraction, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get calcium back out of the cell one of two ways. One way to do it is with a circuit pump. And so circuit pump stands for sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticular calcium ATPase pump. That means I'm going to use ATP to pump calcium back into the cell, or into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that's what's happening during phase 4 is I'm pumping that calcium back in to get ready for the next heartbeat. But I also want to get rid of calcium another way too. So I've got this calcium that's being pumped back in here, but the other way to get rid of calcium is to allow sodium to come in, because when sodium comes in along its concentration gradient, it can drive calcium out of the cell. So now I'm using sodium coming in to get calcium outside of the cell. Now I've got to get the sodium out though. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to use a sodium potassium ATPase pump. And so here I've got this sodium potassium ATPase pump, and now I'm going to pump my sodium out of the cell and bring potassium into the cell. So I got my calcium out by allowing sodium to come in to get calcium out, but now I'm using ATP to get sodium out and bring potassium back in. Just a little clinical information for you. If somebody has a low ejection fraction because their heart can't beat very strong, sometimes they're giving a thing called digoxin or digitalis. And what that does is digoxin or digitalis, it blocks the binding site for potassium on this sodium potassium ATPase pump. So the drug goes in and it blocks that. If it blocks that, I can't get potassium in and I can't get sodium out. As I leave sodium inside the cell, I can't get calcium out. But then what takes place is more calcium gets pumped into the sarcoplasmic reticulum by my circuit pumps. And then, of course, the next time I have my heartbeat, when calcium comes in and plugs into the RYR2, because I have more calcium stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum now, I release more calcium and I have a stronger contraction. All right, so let's go back to this. We're going to look at the circuit pump here. Now, the circuit pumps are pulling calcium out of the cytoplasm here and putting it back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But there's this thing called phospholamban. And what phospholamban does is it blocks, it kind of inhibits the circuit pump. So phospholamban is inhibitory to the circuit pumps. It's kind of like if you have a bunch of smoke or a bunch of steam in a room and you've got a fan pulling it out, phospholamban is standing there blocking the fan blades as they come around and slowing down you pulling this steam or this smoke out. So let's look and see what norepinephrine does. When norepinephrine shows up, here's what it's going to do. Norepinephrine shows up, plugs into a beta-1 receptor. When it plugs into the beta-1 receptor, it's going to activate a GS protein. That GS protein is going to increase the amount of cyclic AMP, which activates protein kinase. That in turn is going to open up more L-type calcium channels. So now we have more L-type calcium channels opening up, and as more L-type calcium channels open up, more calcium comes in, plugs into more RYR2 receptors, releases more calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, plugs into more troponin, exposes more actin, and we have a stronger contraction. However, because we've released more calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, what that might do is that might stretch this out this direction and make for a longer contraction or a longer time between contractions, because now we have to pull it back in. But the other thing that happens is the activation of cyclic AMP and protein kinase. It inhibits phospholamban's inhibition of the circuit pumps, and so now the circuit pumps can start pulling calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum at a much faster rate. And so instead of lengthening it, I might actually get a stronger but shorter contraction. All right? So just to summarize, when you're looking at the autonomic nervous system, the SA node sets the intrinsic rate of the heart. The autonomic nervous system modulates it. ACH modulates it down. It has a negative chronotropic effect. Epinephrine modulates heart rate up. It has a positive chronotropic effect. ACH does not have an effect on the cardiac myocytes. In fact, the effect here is called inotropic, inotropic, tropic change inoforce. And so norepinephrine has a positive inotropic effect on the cell. If we go back here and look at our beta blockers not only block the beta-1 receptors here, but they can also block the beta-1 receptors here. So what it can do is it actually decrease the strength of contraction. And so if I have somebody that I'm concerned about their blood pressure, well, blood pressure equals stroke volume times heart rate times peripheral resistance. Well, if these variables are high, they could have hypertension. If they have hypertension, I want to decrease that. And so my beta blocker, metoprolol, propranolol, labetalol, what they'll do is by blocking these beta-1 receptors, they decrease stroke volume, decrease heart rate, decrease blood pressure, and they decrease your hypertensive states. All right, that's it.